What's up, guys? This is Blue TCG back with another Vanguard video. This video is going to be an overview, profile, and comprehensive breakdown of Silver Thorn Pale Moon in the premium format. Now, Silver Thorn got major changes thanks to the new support provided to it in set 8 of Overdress, known as Minerva Rising. Some of these new cards greatly changed the approach and playstyle of the deck in premium, so we'll be going over these in full detail throughout this video. If you have any questions or comments about what I discussed in this video, do make sure to leave them down in the comments below, and also don't forget, of course, to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out. Now, with these all out of the way, let's go ahead and give a brief overview of the deck. Now, what is Silver Thorn? Silver Thorn is a sub-clan, or sub-archetype as some of you might call it, of Pale Moon that was introduced all the way back in set 7 of the original series of Vanguard, focused around calling cards out from Soul and gaining special bonuses for doing so. Some of the cards that were very strong from back then that allow you to accomplish this are cards such as Zelma and Upright Lion, both of which allowed you to call out cards from Soul very effectively, build your combos, as well as pump this card to insanely high numbers. Now, over the course of the years where we've received new cards and support from not only G-Era but also from V-Series, the identity of the subclan has changed. We now see a more refined strategy where we still are able to call out cards from Soul in the aforementioned manner and get special bonuses for doing so, but now we're able to combine this with a very strong advantage engine that we can repeat each and every turn to allow us to gain a very solid strategy that works very cohesively. We're able to accomplish this with cards from V-Series such as Selvia and Venus Luquier herself, as well as in terms of the card advantage engine loop. We accomplished this with the combination of Doriane and Lolotte to allow us to repeat this every turn. Not only get the card advantage built, but we also are able to protect our board and ensure that we are safe from any sort of removal clans that seek to disrupt our combos. Now, thanks to the new Silver Thorn support and Overdress from Minerva Rising, we're able to see new horizons entirely for Silver Thorn as a deck in premium. Thanks in specific to cards such as Rising Dragon and Breathing Dragon, which for Rising Dragon allows us to construct a massive beat stick that also directs our combo pieces straight to the soul from hand, but also in Breathing Dragon where we're able to make an effective front trigger that not only allows us to play around defensive triggers more easily, but also provides a massive boon to our powerhouse stride in Lantina, as well as even in a stride like we used before, such as Hari or Yvette. These two cards allow us to take the subclan to an entirely new level, so I'm really excited to discuss with you guys the pros and cons as well as the deck profile. Let's get right into them. So now that you guys have a general idea of what today's Silver Thorn is all about, let's go over the pros and cons of the deck. So the pros. Pro number 1. The deck has strong offense led by a very powerful grade 3 turn that goes into an outright monstrous high impact stride in the form of Lantina. Breathing Dragon and Rising Dragon, as mentioned before, take the deck to an entirely new level and allow for the offense to just be extremely efficient, cold-blooded, and really make it a circus to behold when you watch the deck go full throttle, essentially. Now, of course, this strong offense, what's necessary to note about the strong offense is that it's not one card doing everything generally with this deck. It's that you have a lot of cards working together to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as high octane as it possibly can. So despite the fact that we do have these high impact strides in the form of Lantina, we still need everything to contribute in order to get the full ceiling that this deck is able to achieve. Nonetheless, the strong offense is usually very efficient in killing. We can usually achieve that kill turn if we went first on our first stride in the form of Lantina, or if we went second, perhaps the first stride when we go straight into Lantina, or if we don't have enough combo pieces, we go into Darklord Princess into Yvette, and then on the following turn, we hope that we can kill with the Lantina, but it usually just depends on the matchup. Regardless though, very strong offense. Pro number 2. The deck is excellent at cycling and thinning, thanks mostly due to cards like Emile and Doriane, which for the former, Emile allows us to get those combo pieces not only into our soul, but also make sure that our deck is devoid of those normal units that can really ruin our drive checks from hitting those nice and awesome offensive triggers, such as our criticals that we recycle back to the deck thanks to Dixie being such a strong card. It's recursive effect trigger. We love those, right? And also the fact that We have Doriane, which allows us to cycle through our deck a lot faster, ensuring that we see almost everything in our deck at some point throughout the game, or everything that we need for that particular matchup. Really depends. And another card that accomplishes this is a card like Lilian, which equally allows you to search right into the card that you need at the exact moment that you're missing for all of the pieces to come together. So that card not only gets that piece straight into your soul, but also allows you to thin by one card. But regardless, all of this culminates into allowing us to see our triggers more likely, while also ensuring that we go through most of our deck in the time of the game where we know we're probably going to kill or be killed. And pro number 3, sweeping everything into the soul every turn means that it's a jolly old time against decks that require lots of removal in order to function. And because we are not too concerned about Denial Griffin, since we're not running upright line to stack, we don't really care about removal decks in general anymore, especially since our board is not really going to have any cards for them to remove in the first place by the time it gets back to their turn. So that's relevant, of course, as I mentioned, against Kagero. Now, against decks such as Mega Colony, this is not as much the case. Of course, Mega Colony completely shuts down this entire deck strategy, so you do have to be careful about against that clan. But otherwise, it's pretty nice time against a lot of removal-based decks. So now for the cons. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of moving pieces. It's a lot of people all pitching into the efforts made to make this deck get over the finish line, which means that because there are a lot of moving parts, if you don't find them quickly, the so-called impact turns become very, very underwhelming. And running cards that help with the consistency, such as Emile, Lilian, and Irina, they help with this, but they can only do so much because you still got to open them in the correct opening hand, the correct situation. You got to have them ready. And also, because a card like Irina is still technically random, it can just whiff completely and you might be left in a less than desirable position. Let's just say that. So, as I mentioned with the moving parts part, that does mean that in a long tournament that has a lot of rounds, you might find yourself at an inconsistency spell, which means that the deck can easily just lose to itself in a couple of those rounds that you play. So that is a con worth mentioning if you seek to take this deck to a tournament. Con number 2. It's not as counterblast heavy as it used to be, the sub-clan, but it's still counterblast reliant. We have to mention that. We're not relying anymore on spamming out cards from Soul to stack the upright lines to 50k, 60k numbers, abominable numbers, so to speak. But we are still counterblasting to ensure that we can get enough multi-attacks on our opponent to nuke all the cards out of their hand and land the finishing blow on them. And that still does require some counterblast in order to do so with more efficiency if we're seeking to do something like the Breathing Dragon loop or call cards out with Selvia thanks to Dixie. In order to have a little bit of a board before we go into Lantina, which also herself requires a counterblast. So as you can see, there's still a lot of counterblast in the deck, not to mention cards like Lilian, Venus Luquier. They also require counterblast themselves. So we are not suddenly immune to being damage denied. We still sort of suffer against such strategies, such playstyles, such decks that inherently damage deny. But thankfully, since we're not as reliant on damage as we used to be, and we still have the counter charge in the form of Lolotte and friends, we're not as too concerned as we were in the past, where not having 3 counterblasts was really bad in the past. But nowadays, we can probably get away with 2 or even 1. Con number 3, the last con that I'll discuss here, is that the defense of the deck is very mediocre. Just honestly, the hands are usually of extremely poor defensive quality, as almost everything in your hand is usually a combo piece, and it certainly can make for things to be cluttered, if not anything else. Which means that against decks that have equally as good offense as you're in big trouble. And I must say, in fact, that this deck kind of struggles against itself should you play in the mirror match, because it does not defend very well against itself. Let's just say that. But that's also to say that the offense is just that good. Let's just be real here. Having a 2 or more guard restrict on a clan like this, which is already able to put out pretty strong turns to begin with. So with those pros and cons mentioned, we'll now go ahead and transition over to the deck profile. We'll start off with the starter as usual, Silver Thorn Beast Tamer, Emile. Now, I see a lot of differing opinions on this card as a starter for Silver Thorn and Premium, especially nowadays. I still see people running the V-Series starter, which is understandable. It does have its merits in terms of being able to draw on your first ride, as well as getting the quick shield if you go second. Of course, that also helps with the poor defensive quality of hands that this deck has. as I mentioned, the pros and cons. But I feel like Emile, the niche it fulfills is still just a card. It's a niche that's unparalleled really in any other card that is available to this subclan. Allows you to get those combo pieces into the soul right off the bat, as I mentioned several times in videos on this channel. But it also allows you to thin your deck, which honestly you'll notice the impact right away with the deck thinning point. Now, of course, the disadvantage of running this card as a starter does mean that, of course, the opportunity cost of the V-Series starter, as I mentioned, but also the fact that in order to make full use of what this card can accomplish, you have to be willing to call it out multiple times, which means that you'll go a little bit minus, especially in the early phase of the game. That is very noticeable when you go minus, so important to keep those sorts of ideas in mind. But I still feel like this is the most important starter to be able to be willing to run for this clan in order to take it to the next level. Alright, so with the starter out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the grade zeros and trigger units. So we'll start off as usual with 4 copies of the Heal Guardian. This is unchained. You're still running the Heal Guardian because it's the best heal trigger available for most clans in Premium, especially right now. A lot of grade 3 turns are very, very scary, and if they proceed to ride down on you, you need to have a way to not commit too many cards because you're probably not going to get a stride turn if they ride down on you. Now, of course, if they went into something like, if they went into like let's say they stayed on grade 2 and they went into their grade 2 gaming play, this is still useful to have because you're able to still save those cards in hand and then just ride up on them grade 3. I mean, this deck's grade 3 turn is fantastic. It actually really goes hand in hand with Lantina because it allows you to get them to the damage range where Lantina becomes lethal on the crackback. So I still like these Heal Guardians, and the bonuses as well as that Lolotte, which we'll talk about a little later here, can also bring this out of your soul into your hand when you happen to soul charge this off of, let's say, either Mystique Luquier or off of Irina as well when you place it from hand. Cards like that mean that you're able to still get this card into your hand if it goes in the soul by any means. Alright, and then for the next set of cards in our trigger lineup, we've got 4 copies of the Stride Fodder crit. So this remains unchanged from the previous build just before Minerva Rising came out. I think the Stride Fodder crit is necessary, especially given our grade 3 count that we're willing to run for this deck, just because it allows us to avoid having to discard those crucial combo pieces, as well as ensuring that we have a card we're willing to guard with, which, it's a nice 15k value. It helps a bit with mitigating the poor defensive quality of hands of this deck, on top of the fact that it is a 10k trigger. Now, of course, the disadvantage is that it's not a Silver Thorn name, which really does hurt in terms of the typing and the bonus effects that cards like Irina can get. That is very noticeable if you whiff with a card like this because you're not able to get that card draw. It's like a higher chance of not getting the card draw, which is huge for a card like that. So that is a disadvantage, but I do think the pros do outweigh those cons. So it's still worth running the Stride Fodder crit for a build like this, which seeks to put on some aggression, especially early on, so that Lantina can be the coup de grace. Now for the draw triggers, we have 3 draw PGs, which is unchanged from the previous video I did on this subclan. But the one change we've made, and I'm sorry guys, I know that this card is in a very unfortunate state right now in terms of the market, but we're running 1 copy of the D-Series draw trigger. I found this ratio to actually be excellent for the deck. I oftentimes found myself having this draw PG in my hand a little too often, and it's not the greatest because, again, we already have kind of poor defensive hands, and having too many draw PGs in your hand is like just the worst because that means you're using even more cards from your hand in order to defend against a lot of these decks. And since we also just as easily lose to decks that go small but wide instead of tall, we don't want to have a lot of these in our hand because we want to discard with like 5Ks or 10Ks rather than a PG and then discard. The PG is nice for tall decks, of course, but in terms of this deck's weakness defensively, I think that would be wide decks. So having less of these and an additional one of these 10k shields that we're always willing to defend with, I think is especially nice. Now, of course, again, as I mentioned, it's pretty hard to obtain right now. The price is just being jacked up for no reason, and that's just residual of standards long-running issues. I'll talk about these perhaps in a different video, but just understand that I am liking this right now. but it is definitely up to you whether you actually run this or you just stick with the 4 draw PGs, or even not even worry about having that 4th draw trigger, because you might not even think you need it, which is totally fine. But yeah, that's the draw trigger lineup. And then we got a lineup of crits. Now this is slightly different than what I've presented previously. We've got 3 Dixie, and then of course we've got the 1 over trigger to round off the trigger lineup as well. Now the 3 Dixie, why are we cutting this down to 3 from 4? I thought Bluetooth that you said that Dixie is so strong that you need to run 4 copies all the time. Well, somewhat, I did somewhat say that, but to be more specific, I feel like Dixie's a card that you cannot afford to omit at all, just because the recursion, the ability to recurse without even paying any sort of cost. The cost to go back to top of deck is not a cost. Come on, people. It's just an insane way of like allowing your deck to essentially be bigger than it actually is. But also the fact that we're able to call something from Soul for free. Usually this allows us to go into something like Selvia, which allows us to plus even more. But because Selvia costs a counterblast and we don't actually need that many counterblasts for this build, I felt like it was okay to run Dixie at a few less copies. That way we also just highlight even more the 10k triggers that we have in this deck, which we're seeking to find and hit more often thanks to Emile as our starter. So I'd like to hit that more often than hit these 5k trigger Dixies. But trust me, if Dixie were somehow buffed to a 10k trigger in History Collection, I'm instantly running 4 of this. I mean, this card is already solid as a 4 of right now, and if it were 10k, it would just be auto-include in every Silver Thorn deck for sure at 4 copies. But yeah, we're running 3 because we don't need to call from Soul to build our board before Leontina activates as much as we did in the past. Now we can actually even afford to just call things from our hand and then use them as the cards we put in Soul off of Leontina, so that we can call out the maximum number of cards to our circles. So that's kind of my reasoning behind cutting this down to 3, and also that of course allowed us for more room to run the extra draw trigger. And then the 1 over trigger, this is the same as usual. I'm not going to talk further about over triggers. You guys already know how I roll with over triggers on this channel. Okay, and then last but not least, in fact, far from least, this is 2 copies of Lolotte. Probably the most important grade 0 that's not a trigger unit, other than Emile, of course. And that it allows us to get the counter charge and add a grade 3 from Soul to hand, which is what allows us to afford to not have to run as many grade 3s in our lineup as we would ordinarily have to. This also ensures that we countercharge, which by the way frees up counterblast, which is what this deck used to be really weak in. So I mean, this is just an important mitigation measure in ensuring that we can pull off our combos turn after turn, and also essentially defeat our opponent, whittle them down if necessary, or kill them in one blow, whichever is easier to do in order to best them. Lolotte allows us to do all of that. Now, of course, since we're not running it as a starter, which you can decide to run Lolotte as a starter, it's very viable here for this build. If you're not running Lolotte as a starter, you will have to probably search this as high priority off of a card like Lilian or even Irina if you happen to be so good at the game and get it into the Soul by those means. Or if you open it, it's sometimes worth keeping. It really depends. Usually depends if you're able to get a grade 3 in Soul, either through Lilian as well, or just you happen to draw into the grade 3, which means that you probably don't need to search the grade 3 anyway. But point being, you can decide to keep this in your hand. Now I will say that unlike previous builds of Silver Thorn we had, because this build isn't really as counterblast heavy, we can actually afford to not search this out as high priority and still be fine. And this is also the same with Doriane, which is a 1 of, by the way. So in terms of like search priority for a card like Lilian, I'd say this still is priority number 1, but it's not as like high priority where we auto lose if we don't find this in Soul as a means of recovering our counterblast. So do keep that in mind in terms of how this deck plays and the modern identity, so to speak, of Silver Thorn post-Minerva Rising. So that does it for the grade 0s and trigger units. Let's talk about the grade 1s. We're going to start with the standard stuff, guys. We're going to start with Irina, 4 copies of which we're running. Now, I know we're back on 4V Irina, and I did mention in not too long of a video, basically one of the more recent Silver Thorn deck profiles I've done, I did mention that I started liking the OG Irina as a split between that and the V Irina. Now for this build, it's kind of a bit contrary because we always want to open this as much as we can to ensure that we get our best ride and start getting the card draw as well to support our otherwise relatively weak early game. This also supports Emile a little bit, because that way we can save the Emile if we open this, because we want to be able to hit those Silver Thorns off of this card, which Emile can kind of get in the way if we use it right away. Now, of course, use your discretion on that, right? Because if you face a removal clan, then they're probably going to get rid of Emile at their first opportunity, so do be careful and keep that in mind. I still like Irina v Irina as 4 copies in this deck, though, because it's also one of the cards that we're willing to put into the soul off of a card like Emile, just so that we can Soul Blast off of Breathing Dragon, which has become an extremely important component of this deck's kill power. So I do find that to be an important mental benefit of running this over the OG Irina, because OG Irina I was more likely to try to keep it in soul as long as I could so that I can spam it back out. But for this Irina, I'm like, okay, I'm okay with Soul Blasting. I'm okay with even guarding it with it from hand, because it's like this is one of the first cards that you would think of in terms of dropping this down in the Guardian Circle as a 10k shield, because it's not as important to have in the soul. But because we can Soul Blast this off of Breathing Dragon, I think it's nice to mentally have this, mentally for us, it's nice to have this in our deck, because it's a card we're willing to part with should the situation arise. And then, of course, the second ability to get a card into soul off of the top 2 cards of your deck. Because it is mandatory, do be careful when you use it. But if you happen to have this in your hand and you see that it seems fine enough to call it from hand without saving it as shield, then yeah, this is a nice skill to have. But it's a little risky because it technically is random, and checking the top 2 after all is not the most comfortable. The next card we're running is 2 copies of Anna. Anna is like your other solid grade 1 ride, and whenever you'd ride her, it's usually best when you also opened something like Selvia, in which case you would want to use Emile right away, the starter Emile skill. That way you have something to call off of Selvia, while also being able to countercharge and refund the Selvia cost basically on the spot. So Anna's still good for that. It's also good for ensuring that we have enough counterblast for the Breathing Dragon loop, which we'll go over perhaps at the end of this video or in a separate video. I'm not sure which one, depends on how long this video turns out. But regardless, this allows you to refund your countercharge mid-combo. Now, of course, a lot of people do criticize that this card is minus, which, yeah, it is, and it definitely is non-trivial in that regard. But the fact that we're able to refund countercharge means that we're able to go a bit more wild with our offense as well, if we manage our rear guards on field a bit cleverly, which we're able to do, and you guys will see once we go over these combos. But I still like the 2 Anna because it's a decent grade 1 ride, pardon me, and it also has those benefits of being just a nice countercharge refunder in that stage of the game. So you can think of it as 6 cards which you're willing to ride as your best ride targets for grade 1. Alright, and then this hasn't changed, guys. 4 copies of Zelma, still one of the most important grade 1s in our deck. And I know this is another card that is absurdly expensive right now, and I did warn you guys, don't tell me I didn't warn you, because I did mention in the Market Watch video that this card could be seeing a hike in price thanks to any new cards that Silver Thorn might get should it become more popular or whatnot. This subclan is already popular among the crowd because of the waifu Luquier, but that aside, this deck is actually now very legit. I think it's up there in terms of being able to contend with some of the other tier 2 decks perhaps that were floating around in BRO and BCS last season. So anyway, 4 copies of Zelma, still very important for getting those combos off. Now, another important thing about this card, especially since we're using Emile as our starter, is that this card is important to have in hand if you search Lolotte off of Lilian. That way you can call another card from hand, call this out, and then that way the card you called from hand, you can put that into soul, call out the Lolotte, and you have the Lolotte, which you're able to trigger at the end of the turn to countercharge and add a grade 3 if that's what you also had in your soul, either due to an Emile or another Lilian. And then another thing that Zelma is important for, especially nowadays, is that she's able to loop with Breathing Dragon, not just Overdressed Breathing Dragon, but also with V-Series Breathing Dragon, which we're more willing to make use of. This loop has long existed, of course, but it's especially good right now because of Overdressed Breathing Dragon, which powers up our front or rear guards and allows the numbers to exceed what we were able to get before, which was only like 18k if you used G-Era Luquier, which unfortunately G-Era Luquier did not age too well for this build, but G-Era Luquier was what we used before to ensure that we could actually make use of that loop and get an okay number. I mean, the number wasn't that great. 18k is not anything really worth hitting home about, but Now with Overdressed Breeding Dragon, we're actually able to stack, even using this card as well, in order to make sure that our V Series Breeding Dragon loop can actually hit legitimately scary numbers. And we'll talk about the combos, as I mentioned, either in a separate video or at the end of this video, depending on how much time we have. So 4 Zelma is still important. You can run this at 3, but I think 4 allows for a lot of things to be more comfortable, and it really takes this deck to essentially its full capabilities, in my opinion. So now we'll talk about the remaining grade 1s in sequence. So first we've got a split of Rising Dragons from V and D respectively. This card is probably the MVP in terms of the new Silver Thorn cards from Overdressed, in my opinion. Obviously, Rising Dragon is also good, but Breathing Dragon is just insane from Overdressed because it's not a once per turn. I mean, who would have thought putting a once per turn on it would have made the card balanced? I mean, this card is just crazy. But anyway, we're running a split of these because they're both very good with each other. Not just with each other, but also in terms of contributing to the overall strategy that we unlock with this deck nowadays. V-Series Breeding Dragon allows us to extend our attack or go for the loop, depending on how many counterblasts we have. Usually going for the loop is not worth it if you're not able to do it in tandem with Lantina, or if you just don't have like 2 to 3 counterblasts available, because your opponent might not die from it. So, and also it's especially not worth going for if you don't have enough Breathing Dragon stacks. Usually you want either 2 or 3 Breathing Dragon stacks in order to make sure that the number is pumped high enough to, like, let's say 30k. 30k swings for three 30k swings is not half bad for Breathing Dragon. So if you have this counterblast available, it's definitely fine on top of the stacks that I mentioned before. If you get this to 5k 3 times, that's 15k to your front or rear guards, which means that each of those swings are 30k when you combine it with Zelma for the loop. This is also decently good just for 1 extra attack on the grade 3 turn because, again, our grade 3 turn is extremely strong, especially when we have Overdressed Breathing Dragon. So just make sure to use that alongside this to make full use of what this card is able to accomplish in this build. Now, Breathing Dragon, the MVP. This card reads, when it's placed on rearguard circle, when it's placed on back row rearguard circle from Soul, if you have a Vanguard Luquier in the name, you Soul Blast 1, and then you choose one of your Vanguards until end of turn. It gets the following ability: a continuous Vanguard Circle ability. All of your front or rear guards get plus 5k power until end of turn. The till end of turn is that's when the ability wears off, essentially. This card is insane. Because it's not once per turn, that means you can call out Zelma, use the skill to put this in the soul, call it back out. Then if you happen to put Zelma back in the soul thanks to another Zelma, you can do that and call out something like another Breathing Dragon, or you can call out a Selvia to call out a Zelma and Breathing Dragon again, proc Breathing Dragon, and then proc Zelma, put this into soul, call it back out, and you've already procced that 4 times with that combo. And all that took was 1 counterblast and 3 soul blast, or 4 soul blasts rather. But regardless, that means that you're able to get this to pump your front row by an insane amount of power. And also this works well with Lantina because Lantina is calling basically something to all of your circles out again. And if you've already stacked your Breathing Dragon enough times beforehand, that means that those attacks are just going to be insanely hard to deal with by your opponent if they don't have something like Honolly to call, which honestly Honolly is this deck's weakness. We'll talk about that soon though, don't worry guys. But yeah, this Breathing Dragon is insane. It really helps with the grade 3 turn as well because it combines with Venus Luquier's 5k to front row to allow for your grade 3 turn to actually be something your opponent has to respect a little more. No longer can a simple defensive trigger or even a heal guardian fully help them out. Now they have to actually have sufficient cards in their hand that they either prepared in their mulligan or that they drew into from their grade 2 gaming or whatnot, that they can be able to deal with this card easily, because this card just really takes the deck to a whole nother level. Now, unfortunately, because both of these share the name, you can only run 2 of each of them if you run them in the same deck. That is why I'm running a 2-2 split. Otherwise, I'd probably try to run 3 of this and 2 of this. 3 or like I think 3 of this is fine. It's just basically a way of trying to see it more easily. 2 of this still though, because this card is most effective when we get into the Lantina turn. It's not as important for the grade 3 turn, but it's still nice technically. So, and these cards have been cards I'm willing to search off of Lilian if I'm missing them, as long as I have everything else already lined up. That's usually what I've gone for personally. And then we're running 1 copy of Lydia. This card could definitely be taken out for something like the Order PG Elementaria Sanctitude. Just personal preference, really up to you guys if you decide to run this card. I'm still running it though because I like having a Silver Thorn that's searchable as a PG. That way we can actually use it in tandem with Wandering Dragon, whatever that G guard's called. That way we can call this from soul and then discard. It's still 2 cards from hand, but at least it gets around guard restricts a little bit more easily. Now, of course, the guard restricts right now that exist in the meta are not as like it's I won't say not as common, right? Because there's still a lot of guard restricts that exist, but definitely like Colossus existing was like a huge one. So Megalo, whatever that thing is called, the grade 3 that was banned in Gear Chronicle. Now that that's gone, you know, we're not seeing as many guard restricts nowadays, but still having the ability to call this from soul is really nice, because that means you don't have to have a PG directly in your hand. But you can definitely replace this with an order PG if you prefer that. Now keep in mind, if you replace it with order PG, that means you won't be able to search the order PG. You just have to draw into it, so you just have to be just good at the game. But I mean, in order to win, you have to be good at the game. So what difference does it make? All right, that's it for the grade ones. Enough. We talked a lot about that, but those are the major changes to the deck. So I did want to make sure to highlight those in full detail. I warned you guys already in the beginning of the video. Grade 2s, we're starting off with 4 copies of Lilian. This is still unchanged, guys. I do not like the new Lilian personally for this build. We'll talk about that once we get into the alternate card choices section of this video. But I still like V-Series Lin because it gets right to the card that you're missing. At the cost of a counterblast, yeah, but this build is, as I mentioned, not as counterblast heavy, so we can actually, with more comfort, use this counterblast and ensure that we can find that missing combo piece that unlocks everything that we've been looking towards that entire game. Also, the fact that this is an extra 10k beatstick is incredibly relevant nowadays because we are a multi-attack build. We are a multi-attack build now, which means that having that extra 10k when you have 4 names of Silver Thorn in your soul ensures that we can willingly call this out from soul or leave it in the soul just in case we want to have that available as a beatstick of our choice, because that allows for our Leontina to be like even more powerful essentially. And that way also you're a bit more comfortable if you're missing that Rising Dragon, which is strictly speaking the better beatstick. But, you know, we can only run 4 of that beatstick, so might as well have another card that accompanies it with an ability that is still very useful in terms of searching out the Silver Thorn that we want. This also still happens to be our best grade 2 ride, believe it or not. 3 years strong. All right, our next grade 2. This is another MVP and one of the new ones, Rising Dragon, 4 copies of which we're running. I like Rising Dragon, not because of the beatstick, but actually mainly because of that put into soul and draw a card. The most important part about the put into soul is that it puts from hand to soul, which means that those cards that were stuck in your hand that you couldn't put into soul at any point, or at least comfortably, without a G-Guard, for example, such as Flexion Chimera, which I even talked about in the previous video, that's no longer a problem for this build. We're now able to put cards from hand to soul in archetype, which means that we can easily just spam this out if we need to spam the ability with either Zelma or Selvia or whatnot. This card is insanely good. And then on top of that, we get a card draw, by the way, which allows you to, you know, not go minus off of that initial skill, which helps you out with getting combo pieces in the soul. But on top of all of that, we still get an insane beatstick that really the subclan has never seen before. Guys, a 30k beatstick like this is insanely free. Like, our grade 3 turn already basically fulfills this. And then when you go into Leontina, like, this is just the chef's kiss. You get 30k on this by itself. And then when you boost it with something like Breathing Dragon or even Zelma, and then we're not even taking into consideration the Breathing Dragon front row bonus that is effectively a front trigger. I mean, this card hits insane numbers by itself, and we don't even need to like stack it because the four more called from soul condition is incredibly easy to fulfill. Like, we're attacking with it multiple times as well if we try to go to for the Breathing Dragon extension or the loop, in fact. So like, this card is just insane. And the fact, like, I didn't even mention this, guys, it's also a 10k base. Like, can you believe it? We can even ride this for grade 2 gaming should it come to that. Now, of course, we're trying to ride up as soon as we can, but if you feel like the opponent might mess around with you a little bit, like they go to grade 3 then ride down, you might want to ride this on your grade 2 ride instead of Lilian, because you can still use Lilian's ability on the Rigard Circle, so just call the Lilian, you know, that'll work. If you ride this, though, it allows you to be a bit better defensively going into their first grade 3 turn. That way you can tank a bit and not have to worry about the issues this deck has with defense, especially in that stage of the game. So this card is a flat-out MVP. Insanely awesome. I'm even running out of words to describe how good these cards are sometimes. And then to Selvia, this is still the constant of the deck, unchanged. since it released, one of the most important cards that Silver Thorn has received from V Series. We're still running only 2 copies though, because I honestly should like just mention this right now. Cards that used to be like, oh, must see, otherwise we lose. Like, this card is not as must see as it used to be. It's still must see, but it's not as must see as it used to be. On top of the fact that we don't even really need Counterblast as much either. This card still helps though with just going flat out plus, and especially if we want to go into our Lilian turn a bit more comfortably, we want to have this in the soul plus a Dixie in our hand, or just have this in hand outright, in order to make sure that we can call a bit onto our board. That way we can save a few cards in hand if we're not as confident that the Lilian will kill. But otherwise, this card is just still important for functioning in the deck in terms of calling cards from soul, fulfilling that Rising Dragon rather a bit more easily, but Breathing Dragon as well, of course, because we're able to get the 5k stacks more rapidly with a card like Selvia. That's all for the grade 2s, guys. Let's go into the grade 3s. We're not running many grade 3s at all. In fact, we're running only 5 grade 3s. I know, risky, but trust me, there's a plan. There's a reason. We're running 4 copies of Venus Luquier still. I still think this is just the best grade 3 option for the deck. A lot of people I know will be running OGV Luquier, which honestly, I think that card is a bit more reasonable to run for this build now compared to the previous build where we were stacking upright line, just because it provides that extra Luquier name in terms of being a grade 3, while also being able to become a 22k beat stick, which is actually like non-trivial for this deck. But I don't think it is good at all for the Counterblast 2 skill that we have on Vanguard Circle. We are almost never going to want to Counterblast 2 outright, even if it fills our entire board on the spot. Unless, perhaps you have the Ana. If you have the Ana, then, maybe it's fine because you get the Counterblast back, both of them, at the end of the turn, thanks to Lolotte as well. But if you don't have Ana, or if you don't have Lolotte, if you don't have both, then it's horrible to Counterblast 2, especially at that stage of the game. So I think that OGV Luquier is still only useful for the beat stick, essentially, and the Luquier name, of course. That's why I'm still running the Venus Luquiers, which are just always good. You ride them. If you play the grade 3 turn, you get a fantastic effect that allows you to put on some insanely great pressure. And then if you don't have Doriane, you can also get an extra Excel, which means that you don't have to ride explicitly another Venus Luquier. You can just discard one for stride if it comes to that. Now, sometimes you won't be able to ride and then stride just because we're low on the grade 3 count. But if you're able to get the Lolotte to get this back into the hand, then you're able to probably ride and then stride, which is even more awesome because we get that extra Excel. Now, you just have to use your judgment on that one, because oftentimes I found myself just using the Doriane to get the card draw at the end of the turn, which means we have no rear guards for getting the Excel marker that this card provides, which means that we will more than likely have to ride up into another Venus Luquier. Mostly concerned if you go first. If you go second, you're probably just going to go to Darklord Princess into Yvette first stride anyway, which gives you effectively 2 Excel markers on your first stride. So at your discretion, really, whether you use the secondary ability to get that extra Excel. But given that Doriane still provides an excellent means of looping your card advantage, I think that's definitely higher priority than going for the Excel marker ability that Venus Luquier has, should Doriane be available in that regard. But still, most important, grade 3 in my opinion for facilitating all this deck can do, especially thanks to Lilian and its capabilities fully unlocked with the new cards that Silver Thorn got. And then last but not least for the grade 3, and then we have one additional card that we're running, which is a grade 4. We've got one Doriane and we've got one Megalorude. Doriane's still at 1 because it's at 1, and I, like a broken record at this point, this card should not be at 1 anymore in my opinion, but I probably run only maximum 2 nowadays just because space is a bit tight, and all we really want to do is just make sure we don't get this in damage and just instantly cry. That's really the only reason why I would run like more than 1. But anyway, we're still running Doriane because, as I mentioned, it's the card draw engine, but it also allows you to sweep everything into your soul at the end of the turn, ensuring that your board is protected from removal, and also basically guaranteeing that you still have your combo primed and ready for the following turn should they survive somehow the Lilian turn. Excuse me. But with those being said, you will want to make sure that you have enough rearguard space, because at least if you do your first grade 3 turn, then you essentially are guaranteed that you can do Lolotte plus this to get the grade 3 in soul countercharge, as well as do this to get all your rearguards in soul and then draw 2 and then get another grade 3 from soul to hand. But you need to have all your rearguard circles occupied, which can sometimes bring you pretty low in terms of hand size. So you do have to be careful about the trade-offs that you're going for in terms of pulling the full effectiveness of this card off. Regardless, though, it's still a fantastic card. We almost never want to ride this, especially because we miss out on the Luquier name, which has become ever more important of a thing to consider, given that most of our cards still rely on Luquier archetype naming, not just the Silver Thorn archetype. Sorry, Luquier unit naming rather than just the Silver Thorn archetype naming. There we go. So yeah, that's Doriane, and then finally we got one copy of Megalorude. I'm running this not only as a Lantina extender because it frees up a bit of your board space to allow you to call more off of Selvia and such, but it also allows you to remove their Honolly, which this deck honestly extremely easily dies to on the Lantina turn, because we want to use those counterblasts for the Breeding Dragon loop, which is like a lot easier to like certify the kill, right? But if they have a Honolly that they call down, and we don't remove it, then we're in huge trouble. We don't want to go into Dragon Masquerade Hari specifically just to remove their Honolly. Like, that's just not worth it at all. Lantina is way better. So we want to be able to have this available off the Lantina or whatever we decide to go into. That way we can remove their Honolly and continue our efforts to finish them off efficiently. Now, you guys might be wondering, well, what if it's a matchup where Honolly might not be a factor, or what if like Honolly is just not a consideration at all? Because people are starting to drop the card. It depends on the ideas of the player. It depends on the deck, how it fits. But generally speaking, sometimes I do find myself just discarding this for Stride if I find it in my hand. But because we're running Rising Dragon, the new one from Overdress, we're more than willing to run this card. We can just stow it into the soul if we find it in our hand and we have Rising Dragon. That way we still get to replace it with something else, and also having the soul available for the Honolly removal plays as mentioned. And even if we don't use it to remove Honolly, we still got the Lantina extension, which frees up our board space, allowing us to call more stuff out, such as another Rising Dragon, in fact, or even a Lilian or a Zelma or a Breathing Dragon, etc. The possibilities are really endless. So I think this card is still really decent for the build. So guys, that does it for the main deck. I'm glad that you guys made it through, because that was a lot longer than I wanted it to be. I wanted this one to be a bit quicker in terms of the deck profile, because I've covered Silver Thorn quite often on this channel. Of course, you guys already know why I love Silver Thorn. It's one of my favorite decks to play. But regardless, let's go ahead and talk about the G Zone quickly so that we can get to the alternate card choices and discuss a bit more about the deck. So to start off the G Zone hasn't changed too much, but this is the first card we'll go over. We're running one copy of Mystique Luquier. Mystique Luquier is not really a card you ever go into. Sometimes it's just flip fodder, but we still have it in here just because there are cases where you just don't have enough at all in your soul to go for anything better, and you're still comfortable on Excel markers. So you'd go into this just to get extra comp pieces in the soul, hopefully, and then you still also have opportunities to multi-attack with either Breeding Dragon or scare them a little bit with other cards. It's not a card that you definitely want to prioritize, though. I think it's still better to go into other strides such as Darklord Princess, should you be in those situations. But just keep in mind, Yvette doesn't build your soul. All it really does is give you Excel markers and allow you to get a bit of tempo to prepare for your Lantina. That's really all that card does. Should you be in a position where you're running out of cards in soul, especially important to note for if you're running Lolotte as your starter rather than Emile, then Mystique Luquier is still there as an option. However, I find myself flipping this for flip fodder most of the time, especially for this build. All right, then to the rest of our G Zone here, we're running 2 copies of Lantina. Now, a lot of you guys might be running why not 3? Well, if we get sent to the 3rd Lantina, we have another card that might be a little better for that situation. 2 Lantina is usually enough. I go into the first one hoping that they'll die, and the second one is like they really are dead. Like, if they're not dead by the second one, then we're in big trouble, really, because we might have been close to the deck out by that point. But Lantina is your powerhouse stride, your go-to stride. This is what really put the deck over the edge, in my opinion. When this card was first released, I went straight to thinking about Silver Thorn, and certainly the case now. I mean, I'm glad that I'm glad that I knew that it was going to be a good card back then, but little did I know about how really good this deck would be with this card available. I mean, who would have known that a Guard Restrict with a clan that's able to spam cards from Soul and get bonus effects off of them would be good? Who would have known that? The four more different grades is usually fulfilled by Megalorude plus a 0, 1, and a 2, because generally you won't want to call grade 3s for this build unless you're running OGV Luquier. Now, if you're running OGV Luquier, then that's when it's like, okay, now I can call 4, 3, 2, 1, and don't even have to call a 0. But sometimes you still want to call a Lolotte just in case you won't be able to kill them. Or even sometimes you want to call Doriane because they're like, okay, I'm willing to just leave the Doriane on the board and then go into her in the end phase. But you don't want to be careful about that because sometimes they can just remove the Doriane. It really depends. You just got to be present in mind of the matchup. But Lantina is your go-to stride. And then the Boring Gold Darklord Princess package that I'm honestly not even sure if I should bother explaining this, right? Because we've talked about this a number of times on this channel. This hasn't changed at all. I guess one thing to note is that we're running 3 Masquerade Master Hari to be able to flip one of them when we go into our second Darklord Princess if we go into Hari twice in the same game. But otherwise, there's not really anything much to explain here. If you guys aren't familiar with the Darklord Princess package, please do check out one of my previous Silver Thorn deck profiles. I'll put a link to that in the description, as well as ensure that the timestamp leads you straight there to the Darklord Princess package. But yeah, this hasn't changed. We go into this usually on our first stride, or when we're like, okay, Lantina might not kill and we need to remove our board either of lock circles or something like that. So that's when we go into the Darklord Princess package. In fact, actually going into Hari sometimes is a little bit better than Lantina. It just really depends, though. Like, sometimes I found myself first stride going into Hari rather than Yvette, because it's like either one, I don't need the excel, or two, I want to pressure them a bit more than what Yvette would do, because Yvette is not really pressure, it's like setup, whereas Hari is like pressure plus potential to avoid like Link Joker and stuff. So it's important to remember those sorts of things. This is the new addition to the deck. We've got one copy of Dust. Dust is like the third Lantina, so if you don't have Dust, or you're not willing to spend the money, you can just run the three Lantina and you'll be fine. We're running Dust in here just in case we get sent to that moment, because Darklord Princess does automatically fulfill the 3 face-up G units in your G zone for Dust to be online. And the fact that we're not using as many counterblasts for this build means that we'll have access to Dust with a bit more ease. And then on top, all of that on top of the fact that we can avoid Honolulu basically entirely. The opponent can't call it from their hand without something like Pumo, which people don't really run these days. So since they can't G-guard, since they can't have, like the Honolulu on the field becomes rendered moot, we don't have to worry about any of those sorts of things, and we can just go straight for the kill. All right, and of course we don't really care about losing our G zone if the dust doesn't kill. We don't care about losing our G zone because our grade 3 turn is still amazing. So no worries there. And then for the rest of our G zone, which consists of the G Guardians, we've got 2 Wandering Dragon, 2 Flexion Chimera, 1 Furnival, 1 Coolfard. Now, honestly, I found myself liking Flexion Chimera less and less now that we have Rising Dragon in this deck. Let me move this over just a bit. Now that we have Rising Dragon in the deck, it's a lot easier to get stuff from hand to soul to ensure that we have the combo pieces available when we need them. So I'm honestly considering cutting Flexion Chimera down to 1, potentially, but it's still important to have in the G zone just to punish opponents that don't play around it. But because people play around it, this card is just not very good, especially for a deck like this where our hand quality is not good already. And then on top of that, we're minusing a lot more in order to get extra shield. The only way that's useful is if we want to convert the low shield cards in our hand into extra 10Ks, but that can only be done for 1 attack. So against decks that are wide, that is really, really bad for us. Like, we don't want to be using Flexion Chimera. So I'm honestly considering cutting it to 1 and putting in another Furnival, because Furnival is amazing. I've actually found this card to be a lot more lovable now, because if we ride up to grade 3 first, we might be missing like 1 or 2 pieces, but then Furnival can find that potentially off the top 3 and still get a 20k shield off of our heal trigger discarded. So very, very decent measure to use defensively for this deck. Coolthard is like, Coolthard, whatever. Wandering Dragon's alright as well. Still soul charges and cost something from Soul to Guardian Circle. It's never been bad. It's always been useful to some degree. So you still gotta run it. Yeah, that's it for the G Zone, guys. That's it for the entire deck profile. We'll talk about some alternate card choices for the remainder of this video, and we'll touch on a bit of the combos and such in a separate video just to make sure that we keep this video nice and condensed. I know it's already getting pretty long though, so let's go ahead and get to that. Now, I'll use the remainder of this video to discuss some alternate card choices as I don't have a tournament report for this deck. So let's go ahead and talk about some cards that didn't quite make the cut but are still worth mentioning. So we'll talk about first the other new overdress cards that Silver Thorn received from Minerva Rising that were not in this deck. Now this isn't all of them, of course. There's one more card that's missing here, which is Irina, but for obvious reasons I'm not going to include this in our discussion. So Silver Thorn Dragon Tamer Luquier, the one from Overdress, she's named the same name as the original Luquier, as well as the one from V-Series that was the original from VBT06. Now, why aren't we running this card? I mean, it is 13k base, it does also offer Persona Ride, and it has a decent end of turn skill to allow us to suck some rear guards into Soul from our field and get a card draw on top of that as well. The reason I'm not running this is actually with only one reason, which is the fact that it doesn't give us an Excel marker. We need Excel markers for Lilian to be as powerful as it is, so the fact that this doesn't have the imaginary gift icon at the top left is an unfortunate downside that I think causes this card to just miss the cut. Otherwise, I'd be more than willing to consider running this, especially in its own build. I might draft a couple new builds to see if I can incorporate this card in a meaningful manner, but you know, it didn't quite make the cut for reasons as just mentioned. Now, some of the benefits about it that I think if you guys are willing to consider it, I'll just mention my thoughts about it right now. 13k is a huge plus. This deck already suffers defensively, so having that extra 1k on its body is insanely incredible. I think that is definitely underrated, especially for a clan of this caliber, or a subclan of this caliber that exists in the context of Pale Moon, which is, you know, traditionally the Excel clan, which has a bit less defensive base, right? So having the 13k base I think is very nice. And then also the fact that at the end of the turn puts 2 rear guards in a soul and draws a card means that it can fulfill Lolotte's function of ensuring that Doriane doesn't get retired off of its skill without actually needing Lolotte. Now, of course, it doesn't countercharge like Lolotte does, but, you know, not a huge deal necessarily. We could still run Lolotte itself if that's what we're looking for anyway. And then finally, the ability to put something from hand to soul off the cost for Counterblast 1 for its first ability means that we can, similar to Rising Dragon, get some stuff into soul from our hand to ensure those combo pieces are nice and snug in there, as well as ensure that we can potentially call more stuff out as the game goes longer. And of course, the Persona Ride icon really helps with that as well. If we were to Persona Ride this and then stride into Lilian, that is like 2 Breathing Dragons already procced already. And that applies to our entire front row as opposed to just the front row rear guards. So that's really nice for what it can fulfill in those regards. So that's Luquier herself, and then we'll talk about the order next. So the order I think is okay. When I tested it for this build especially, I found it to be a bit clunky. The unfortunate part about it is that it costs a counterblast on activation. Now, if it, you know, it's understandable that it does, and that's honestly not really the biggest problem with this card. The biggest problem that I actually find with this card is that it is given to the rear guard and it triggers when the Vanguard attacks, which is just hugely unfortunate. Like, imagine if this was given to the Vanguard and triggered when the rear guard attacked at the end of the battle. Like, that would actually be really, really good, because then we can trigger stuff like Honor or Marichka, which we'll talk about, of course, soon as cards that didn't make the cut. Marichka, that being Marichka, of course. Those cards can actually trigger off of something more meaningful than just using it from our stride or from our Luquier turn. Where ordinarily those cards are just a bit weirdly worded and made it seem like they just didn't want them to be good. So that's what this card could have been, but alas, we have this instead, and I'm not finding it to be like that cohesive with the best of what this new strategy is. It's, you know, it's all right in Overdress itself, but it's like in Premium it's like just okay. And I think my initial evaluations from my Silver Thorn video where we talked about these before they came over to English when they were first revealed, I think basically my assessment was not too different back then as where it is now. I would have thought this card to be the 3rd best among those revealed, but I actually think it's the 4th best, just behind the new Luquier. And of course, new Luquier, the only reason she didn't make the cut is because we don't get an Excel marker from her. So she doesn't excel in that regard. Ha, you see what I did there. But yeah, that's the order. Of course, the fact that we can be played from souls is a very nice thing, but it's just not good enough, in my opinion, to make the cut. And then finally, we got Lilian. The new Lilian is all right as well. It's actually better in Nightmare Dolls, believe it or not, because Nightmare Dolls can use it as part of their ride down and get very strong advantage built while potentially getting some more combo pieces into their soul. And getting something from soul to hand is not something that Nightmare Dolls was always able to do. So I think this card is much better for that deck than for Premium Silver Thorn. Now, that being said, the ability to get an extra 5k shield as well as 5k power is decent. I think that can definitely be worked with in Premium, but in terms of opportunity cost, you guys, the rules in terms of sharing the name with V-Series Lilian, I think makes such that V-Series Lilian is still just the way to go from here on, and you got to maximize the copies you run of her for it to be good enough to be worth running. So that's why we're not running the Lilian from Overdress and Silver Thorn whatsoever. Now, of course, again, 10k base, really nice, but we've got that in Rising Dragon, which already does a lot of other things but better. So that's why I'm not really too sold on running Lilian for our build here. So that's my evaluation of the other, notable Silver Thorn cards from Overdress, Minerva Rising that didn't make the cut. We'll talk about some other options from V-Series that I see people sometimes running in their list on YouTube, but I'm not running personally, and I'll give my reasons why. So we'll start with the V-Series cards, shall we? So we'll do Romy first, and then we'll do Marichka, and then we'll do Venus Luquier. So Romy first. I think this card is fine. It's like a mini Emile. It allows you to check top 3, put any number of Silver Thorns in the soul, the rest go to the bottom. The problem with Romy, though, is that you don't get it right at the start of the game. You have to open it, or you have to draw into it, or basically you have to find it somehow. And I think a card like this is best when you can get it going as early into the game as possible. Just the ability to get stuff in the soul combo pieces. The earlier you do that, the better you are, the better position you're going to be in for the rest of the game. So that's my stance on cards like this. That's why I'm not running Romy here. I think it's a decent card, though, but I just don't find it worth running, especially when we have Emile as our starter. Marichka, I so wanted to run this card for this build, but I couldn't find a good slot for her. The issue is that it's not necessary. I'm just going to be honest. We don't really need it for this build. It helps a bit for having a decent grade 2 ride, right? Because it allows us to draw some more cards, potentially get more stuff in the soul. And if you're not running Emile, you're definitely going to notice the effects of that. In fact, I do think you should be running this card if you're running Lolotte as a starter, but it's just hard to find space for it. So that's why I'm not running it. But I do think it's all right enough to run. It's not like it's an entirely bad card for this deck now. And I was just running it a few builds ago, so it's not like a bad card entirely. Finally, Luquier Reverse. I said Venus Luquier, I think, when I put this card down. My apologies. I always get the names blurred. But Luquier Reverse. This card, Lantina doesn't really need more than 2 Excel markers to be good. I think even with 1, it's fine, but 2 is where the card is extremely good. And we usually have 2 organically by the time we stride into her. So I don't think Luquier Reverse is needed. That being said, I think this card can still effectively be good. Raising the ceiling of Lantina is not a bad thing at all. And there technically is space for this. There is a slot for this, especially since we're not using as many counterblasts as we were in previous builds. So all of that mentioned, I do think it is fine to run this card if you happen to have ways to lock enough cards in your rear guard circles without having to commit too much to cards on your board. But for this to be as good as that, as I made it sound, you have to find this pretty early in your soul, which means you probably got to run at least 2 copies of it, which unfortunately is just hard to come by that space in this build. So that's why I'm not running it, but I do think it's actually more decent than I thought, compared to what I think I had assessed it as. We're definitely not running it in that video I did, but I think this card has some merits, so it's not entirely bad. So those are the V-Series cards I thought it was worth talking about a little bit in terms of alternate card choices. Now let's talk about some older options that would ordinarily be considered but are just no longer being run in this build. So we talked already about Upright Lion. For obvious reasons, stacking Upright Lion is no longer needed when we just have plenty of awesome ways like Breathing Dragon from Overdress as well as Rising Dragon from Overdress to pump our numbers on all of our board already, so I don't think Upright Lion is needed anymore. And that Upright Lion was basically just a means of extracting the best capabilities available to Silver Thorn at the time. So this card always had, you know, its days numbered in my opinion, but it was nice while we had it. So I'm definitely not saying that's a bad card by any means, but we just don't need it, which I'm honestly glad for. Irina is a card that I think is still very good, and in fact, if you're running Lolotte as your starter, you might consider running this, because being able to spam such an ability I think is much better in this regard than doing it with Romy, because you're able to get this on place rather than as an activated ability, which means you can get this during the battle phase, and the card you put into soul during the battle phase you can still call out later on, if you're able to achieve that with any skills that are available. So I think this Irina is still fantastic, and I talked already a lot about her in the grade 1 lineup of the deck profile, so just make sure to rewind to that point if you need additional thoughts and ideas on why this card would be still good to run. Finally, we've got Cerne. Cerne is just not good in Lantina, for this reason only. It's the fact that when you go into your Lantina turn, Lantina puts all of your rear guards into soul on attack, which means that you won't even be able to get Cerne skill. Like, you literally will not be able to get Cerne skill ever. So, you know, previously when we had Hari as our main finisher off of Darklord Princess, then yeah, Cerne was definitely fantastic. But I personally don't think it's worth running anymore. Yeah, it's decent, I guess, if you want to get the counterbalance 1 for a free card out of soul, but we can do that already with Selvia. No need to run this anymore. But it's still a good card, mind you. It's just that with Lantina, it's a bit clunky, and it's not as coherent as it might seem. Finally, we've got some older cards that, you know, you guys probably aren't surprised that didn't make it, but I do want to talk a little bit about them. One is Venus Luquier. Rest in peace. This card was almost never good. I cannot think of a single point in time where it was good, but except for this one reason, I guess, which was that, hey, I could call a card from soul for free, unlike Mystique Luquier, but even Mystique Luquier is a little bit better just because it triggers Goman, which is, you know, a funny interaction. It also soul charges, which helps a bit with finding common pieces, all of that. So I think Mystique Luquier is still better than this card. If they somehow errata this, though, I'm going to be very happy that I kept it for this long, because I've been looking for the time and place to be able to make this card like viable in the G zone. Cat 9 High Boots. I was running this literally the most recent build before shooting this video. This card is still good, but the problem is that it's not Silver Thorn named, which, guys, this is part of the cons, and I didn't really mention this explicitly, but Silver Thorn relies a lot on archetyping, so any cards out of the archetype that are available generically to Pale Moon don't work well with the deck. Cat 9 High Boots still can work, though, because we have Flexion Chimera, we have the new card in Rising Dragon, which makes this a bit more stable. If we draw into it, we can just put it right into Soul from hand and then draw one card after that. That way, if we go into our stride, we have a free card out of Soul, so we don't have to commit too many cards from hand. But at the end of the day, I ended up cutting it out because I preferred having more consistency of the existing pieces rather than adding this card as sort of a win more easily card. It's not like a win. I shouldn't say win more card because it still helps out. It's still noticeable, its impact, especially if you don't kill in that turn. But you're banking on the fact that the Lantina turn will kill, which means that this card is not going to be as big of a difference really if you just call cards from hand outright anyway. Now, if you use this card, it's not a bad thing though, because I was running in my most recent build and I just cut it for this video because I wanted to give like the most refined build I could for you guys to start as your foundation, and then you build from there should you decide to make any changes to it on your own. Finally, Silver Thorn Dragon Tamer Luquier, bringing this card out to point a few things out that I mentioned about just as a follow-up from that Silver Thorn video where I discussed the new cards when they were first revealed. Now, since we're not going to be using Mystique Luquier or any of the Silver Thorn strides for that matter, this card is just not worth it at all, especially with the new Overdressed Breathing Dragon. I don't know if this card will ever make its way back into Silver Thorn in any build for the foreseeable future, unless they errata some of these, which, you know, we'll see if the history collection affects any of these old Silver Thorn cards from Jira, but if not, then we're stuck with these. You know, it's doubtful that they'll get touched, so I do think this card has become obsolete now thanks to Overdressed Breathing Dragon. Alright guys, and that's going to do it for my discussion of alternate card choices. I hope this detail gave you a great idea on how to play the subclan in this modern metagame, as well as hopefully give you ideas for how you can build your own Silverthorn deck and perform the most brilliant circus the world has ever seen. So with that, and of course, guys, I mean that sincerely. So with that, guys, thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time in the combos that I'll be demonstrating to accompany this video. Look out for the uploads for that soon. I'm not sure when they'll be out, but I'll try to get them out close to when this video is published. So look out for those, guys. See you then.